Deep within NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, Dr. Sarah Chen stared at her computer screen in absolute terror. The latest images from the James Webb Space Telescope showed something impossible: geometric structures larger than galaxies, existing in regions of space that formed before time itself began. But Sarah recognized these patterns. 20 years ago, as a CIA operative infiltrating underground cults, she'd seen identical symbols carved into ancient temples across 3 continents. The same symbols that drove entire civilizations to madness. Now those symbols were staring back at her from the deepest reaches of space, and according to the telescope's data, they were moving, approaching. The structures had been dormant for 13.8 billion years, but the moment humanity looked directly at them, they awakened. Sarah's hands trembled as she realized the horrifying truth. The James Webb hadn't just found evidence of ancient alien civilizations. It had sent a signal across the cosmos, announcing humanity's location to something that had been waiting in the darkness since before the universe was born. What happens when humanity's greatest achievement becomes its greatest mistake? The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah forced herself to breathe slowly, drawing on training she'd hoped never to use again. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with muscle memory, encrypting the files and burying them deep in classified folders. The weight of her past pressed against her chest like a physical thing. She remembered the temple in Myanmar first, carved into limestone cliffs that locals refused to approach. The symbols had covered every surface in perfect mathematical progression, spiraling inward toward chambers where her team found the remains of an entire monastery. The monks had clawed their own eyes out before death took them, their final journal entries filled with ravings about the watchers beyond the void. Then Cambodia. The same symbols, older than Angkor Wat, hidden beneath centuries of jungle growth. The archaeological team had vanished 3 days before Sarah's arrival, leaving behind only cameras filled with footage of the walls seeming to shift and writhe in the darkness. And finally, the dig site in Peru that had ended her intelligence career. The symbols there hadn't just been carved, they'd been burned into solid granite by something that reached temperatures exceeding those found in stellar cores. The local indigenous people called it the place where sky demons sleep, and their oral histories spoke of lights in the heavens that answered when the symbols were disturbed. Sarah had recommended the site be buried and forgotten. Instead, her superiors had branded her unstable and forced her into early retirement. That's when she'd turned to astronomy, seeking the cold comfort of observable facts and measurable phenomena. The irony wasn't lost on her now. A soft knock at her office door made her jump. "Dr. Chen?" The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, her graduate assistant, named coincidentally after the telescope itself. "The 7 o'clock data review? Everyone's waiting in conference room B. Tell them I need 10 more minutes," Sarah called back, her voice steadier than she felt. She couldn't let anyone else see this. Not yet. Not until she understood what they were dealing with. She pulled up the spectral analysis data, her stomach dropping as the numbers confirmed her worst fears. The structures weren't just ancient. They existed in a region of space that should have been pure cosmic background radiation, the afterglow of the Big Bang itself. According to every model of cosmology, nothing could have formed there, nothing should exist there. Yet the telescope had captured them in perfect detail across multiple wavelengths, vast geometric lattices stretching across millions of light years, their surfaces reflecting light that had been traveling toward Earth since before the first stars ignited. The mathematical precision was unmistakable. These weren't natural formations. They were constructed, and they were responding. Sarah overlaid the data from the past 72 hours, watching in horror as the structure's energy signatures shifted from dormant background radiation to active emissions. The change had begun exactly 18 hours after the telescope's deep field sensors had locked onto their coordinates. Something had noticed the attention. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from a number she hadn't seen in 20 years. "The Myanmar team is all dead. Peru site excavated last month. They found the source chamber. We need to talk. Director Hayes." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Hayes had been her CIA handler, the one who'd buried her reports about the symbols. If he was reaching out now, after 2 decades of silence, it meant the situation had moved far beyond academic curiosity. She minimized the astronomical data and pulled up news feeds from Myanmar, Cambodia, and Peru. The headlines made her nauseated: mysterious seismic activity detected at ancient sites, mass hallucinations reported in jungle regions, unexplained radio signals originating from archaeological zones. The symbols weren't just responding in space, they were awakening on Earth too. Sarah saved her work to an encrypted drive and stood up on unsteady legs. Whatever was coming, humanity had perhaps hours, not days. The universe's greatest predator had been sleeping in the darkness between galaxies, and humanity had just turned on the lights. The elevator descended into the bowels of the Goddard Space Flight Center, past floors that didn't exist on any public directory. Sarah's security badge, black with silver striping that marked her as having cosmic clearance, granted access to levels that most NASA employees would never see. The fluorescent lights flickered with each floor they passed, casting intermittent shadows across her face. Director Marcus Webb stood beside her, his usual composed demeanor cracked around the edges. She'd known Marcus for 8 years, since her transition from the intelligence community to NASA, and she'd never seen him this unsettled. His fingers drummed against his tablet in a rhythm that matched her own accelerated heartbeat. "How many people know?" Sarah asked as they passed the 20th basement level. 12. The night shift team that first processed the data. Myself, and now you." Marcus's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent the last 6 hours trying to convince himself he wasn't losing his mind. "I've isolated the entire floor. Official story is a gas leak." The elevator stopped with a soft chime that seemed absurdly cheerful given the circumstances. They walked through a maze of corridors lined with servers, their collective hum creating a technological symphony that vibrated through the floor and into Sarah's bones. The Deep Space Analysis Laboratory sat at the center of it all, a room filled with quantum computers capable of processing data from the farthest reaches of space. Dr. Elena Vasquez looked up from her workstation as they entered. Her dark eyes were rimmed with red, and Sarah counted at least 6 empty coffee cups scattered around her desk. Elena had been running spectral analysis on deep space images for 15 years, and Sarah had never seen her look so shaken. "Tell me you found an error in the data," Sarah said, though she already knew the answer from Elena's expression. "I've run the verification protocols 47 times, Elena said, pulling up a holographic display that filled the air between them. "The quantum interference patterns are consistent, the gravitational lensing calculations check out, the light decay matches expected parameters for objects at the edge of the observable universe." The image materialized before them, and Sarah felt her breath catch. It was clearer now than it had been on Marcus's tablet. The structures, and there was no other word for them, stretched across space in impossible geometries, spiraling towers that seemed to fold in on themselves, connected by bridges that defied Euclidean physics. The construction materials appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating voids in space that hurt to look at directly. "The dating?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "That's where it gets interesting." Elena manipulated the display, highlighting sections of the structure in different colors. The cosmic microwave background radiation around these objects shows anomalies. The redshift suggests they've been there for approximately 15.2 billion years. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The universe is only 13.8 billion years old. According to our current models, yes. Marcus stepped closer to the hologram, his face pale in the artificial light. "There's more, Sarah. Show her the movement analysis." Elena's fingers danced across her interface, and the display shifted to show the same structures across multiple time intervals. Sarah leaned forward, studying the progression of images taken over the past 72 hours. "They're rotating," she whispered. 17 degrees per hour, Elena confirmed. "Consistent, precise rotation. And there's something else." The display zoomed in on one of the spiral towers, Look at the surface patterns. Sarah squinted at the enhanced image. What she had initially taken for random surface textures began to resolve into something else entirely. Patterns. Deliberate, repeating patterns that covered every visible surface of the structures. They're covered in symbols, she breathed. Or circuitry, Elena suggested quietly. The patterns show electromagnetic activity. Faint, but measurable. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. These weren't just impossible structures floating in the void, they were active, functional. The patterns pulsed with a rhythm that reminded her uncomfortably of a heartbeat. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. He gestured for Elena to switch to another display. "Show her the directional analysis." The new image appeared, showing the structures from multiple angles. Elena had calculated the orientation of the major towers, the positioning of the bridges, the alignment of what appeared to be sensor arrays jutting from the main structures. Every single element was pointed directly at Earth. Sarah stared at the display for a long moment, her mind racing through possibilities and rejecting each one. Ancient alien civilizations, temporal anomalies, parallel universes, none of it made sense. Yet the evidence floated before her in perfect holographic detail. "We need to consider the possibility," she said slowly, "that these structures aren't just observing, they're waiting." The room fell silent, except for the steady hum of the servers. 3 of the brightest minds in astrophysics stood in the depths of a government facility, staring at proof that humanity was not alone, and that something impossibly old had been watching them for longer than their universe should have existed. The secure briefing room in Building 29 felt smaller than usual as Sarah watched Director Harrison pace behind the mahogany table. The morning light filtering through reinforced windows cast harsh shadows across the faces of the assembled team, a carefully selected group of NASA's most trusted scientists and security personnel. "What you're about to see cannot leave this room," Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of sleepless nights. "Dr. Chen, proceed with your analysis." Sarah stood, her fingers trembling slightly as she activated the holographic display. The Webb telescope's data materialized in 3 dimensions above the table, and she heard the sharp intake of breath from Dr. Marcus Webb, the mission's theoretical physicist. "At 13.5 billion light-years from Earth, we've identified a cluster of artificial structures," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Initial analysis suggests they're composed of materials that shouldn't exist in our universe's early timeline." The hologram rotated slowly, revealing the impossible geometry she'd been studying for days. The structures defied conventional architecture, spiraling towers that seemed to fold in on themselves, platforms that existed at impossible angles, and at the center, something that hurt to look at directly. "The problem," Sarah continued, "is that these images show us the universe as it was 13.5 billion years ago. The Big Bang occurred 13.8 billion years ago. This gives us only 300 million years after the initial cosmic expansion for these structures to be built." Dr. Elena Vasquez, the mission's cosmologist, leaned forward. "That's impossible. The universe was barely cool enough for the first stars to form. There were no heavy elements, no planets, no conditions that could support the construction of whatever these are." Sarah nodded grimly. "Exactly, but there's more." She manipulated the display, zooming in on one of the central structures. "Look at this carefully. Notice anything unusual about the positioning?" The team studied the image in silence until Dr. Webb's face went pale. They're aligned." "Aligned with what?" Harrison demanded. Sarah felt her mouth go dry. "With Earth." Despite being captured by Webb's instruments positioned at Lagrange Point 2, the structures appeared to be oriented toward our solar system's current position. Not where we were 13.5 billion years ago, but where we are right now. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Security Chief Amanda Torres spoke up. "Dr. Chen, are you suggesting these structures somehow knew where Earth would be billions of years before our solar system even existed?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Sarah replied. though her intelligence training screamed warnings. "I'm presenting the data, but there's something else." She paused, knowing her next words would change everything. "I've been monitoring Webb's instruments continuously since the discovery. The structures appear to be responding." "Responding how?" Harrison's voice was sharp. Sarah manipulated the display, showing a time-lapse sequence from the past 48 hours. Subtle changes in positioning, reconfiguration of certain elements. And this? She highlighted a section of the main structure where new geometric patterns had appeared. This pattern emerged 12 hours after our initial observation. Dr. Vasquez stood abruptly. "You're saying they know we're watching them?" "I'm saying the data suggests a correlation between our observation and their behavior." Sarah's analytical mind warred with her growing dread. "But there's a temporal problem with that theory." "Explain," Harrison ordered. "We're seeing them as they were 13.5 billion years ago. Any signal we might send would take that long to reach them. Conversely, any response from them to our observation would require them to have known we were watching 13.5 billion years before we actually started watching. The implications hung in the air like a physical presence. Torres was the first to voice what everyone was thinking, unless they're not bound by our understanding of causality." Sarah nodded slowly. "Or unless they exist outside our normal space-time framework. The structures show characteristics that suggest they might be multidimensional, projections of something larger that we can only perceive partially." Dr. Webb's hands shook as he reached for his coffee. "This could revolutionize our understanding of physics, of the universe itself. Or it could mean we're being observed by intelligences that predate the very concept of time as we understand it," Sarah countered. Her intelligence background had taught her to consider threats, and every instinct she possessed was screaming danger. Harrison stopped pacing and faced the group. "I've already been in contact with the highest levels of government. This information is now classified at the highest possible level. Dr. Chen, I want continuous monitoring. Any change, any new development gets reported immediately." As the meeting dispersed, Sarah remained behind, staring at the holographic structures. In the shifting patterns of their geometry, she could swear she saw something that resembled recognition, as if whatever had built these impossible monuments across the cosmos had been waiting with infinite patience for this exact moment of discovery. The universe suddenly felt much less empty and infinitely more dangerous. The quantum entanglement lab hummed with an energy that made Sarah's teeth ache. She stood before a wall of monitors displaying data that challenged everything she thought she knew about physics, consciousness, and humanity's place in the universe. The structures weren't just watching, they were responding to observation itself, their geometry shifting in ways that suggested they existed partially outside normal spacetime. "Show me the temporal displacement readings again," Sarah commanded, her voice steady despite the growing dread in her chest. Dr. Marcus Webb, the team's quantum physicist, pulled up a series of waveform patterns that looked like cosmic heartbeats. "Every time we focus the Webb telescope on a specific structure, these readings spike. It's as if our active observation creates a quantum bridge across 13 billion years." Sarah studied the data, her intelligence training kicking in. Pattern recognition had kept her alive during Black Ops missions in hostile territories, and now those same instincts screamed warnings. "These aren't random fluctuations, there's intentionality here." "That's impossible," Webb protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Objects can't exhibit intentional behavior across that distance and time frame, unless they're not bound by conventional physics." Sarah pulled up the latest images on the main display. The structures had changed again, subtle modifications to their crystalline surfaces that formed what looked disturbingly like mathematical proofs. "Marcus, run a translation protocol on these surface patterns." Her fingers flew across the holographic interface, isolating sections of the alien architecture. Each structure seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, and when she overlaid their frequencies, they created a complex harmonic that resonated at exactly 7.83 Hz, Earth's natural frequency, the Schumann resonance. "Jesus Christ," Webb whispered. "Sarah, look at this." The translation software had identified recurring symbols embedded in the structure's geometry. Not human language, but mathematical concepts that transcended species, prime number sequences, the golden ratio, fundamental constants of physics. But there was something more, patterns that human mathematics hadn't yet discovered. "They're teaching us," Sarah realized, her blood running cold. "Or testing us." The lab's ambient lighting suddenly dimmed as every monitor simultaneously displayed the same image. One of the structures rotating to reveal a new face, its surface covered in what could only be described as windows. Through those impossible apertures, something vast and patient seemed to peer back at them. "Cut the feed," Sarah ordered. "I can't." Webb's hands shook as he frantically worked his controls. "The system's not responding. It's like something else is controlling the telescope." The James Webb Space Telescope, humanity's most sophisticated eye into the cosmos, had become someone else's instrument. Sarah watched in horror as the telescope's orientation shifted, no longer pointing toward the ancient structures, but turning its gaze toward Earth. The implications hit her like a physical blow. If these entities could control human technology across impossible distances, what else could they manipulate? Emergency shutdown. Now. Sarah reached for the manual override, but stopped when she noticed movement on the screens. The structures were changing more rapidly now, their surfaces flowing like liquid metal, reconfiguring into new shapes that hurt to look at directly. The geometry seemed to fold in on itself, creating optical illusions that made her brain struggle to process what she was seeing. Then the whispers started. Not audible sounds, but thoughts that weren't her own, pressing against the edges of her consciousness like fingers probing the boundaries of her mind. Mathematical concepts flooded her awareness, equations describing the birth and death of universes, the mechanics of consciousness itself, and something else, something that made her stagger backward from the displays. The knowledge that Earth had been found. "Sarah," Webb's voice seemed to come from very far away. "The quantum field generators are overloading. We need to evacuate." But Sarah couldn't move. The alien mathematics continued pouring into her mind, showing her visions of what lay beyond the observable universe, an infinite darkness populated by structures like the ones they'd discovered, each one a sentinel, each one part of a vast network that spanned dimensions humans hadn't imagined. And at the center of it all, something ancient and patient and terrifyingly aware was turning its attention toward a small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system. The lab's emergency lighting activated as the main power grid failed. In the strobing red illumination, Sarah saw Webb struggling with equipment that sparked and smoked. But her attention was fixed on the monitors, where the images had stabilized into one final, impossible sight. The structures were moving. After 13 billion years of patient waiting at the edge of existence, they were beginning a journey that would culminate at Earth's doorstep. The math flooding Sarah's consciousness told her exactly how long it would take them to arrive. Not billions of years, but mere decades, because these entities didn't travel through space. They traveled through time itself, and they were coming home. The emergency session convened at 0400 hours in the highest security wing of Goddard Space Flight Center. Sarah had barely slept, her mind churning through the implications of what she'd discovered in the data streams. The conference room's sterile fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across the faces of the assembled team, astronomers, physicists, and 3 individuals she didn't recognize, wearing the kind of nondescript suits that screamed classified operations. Director Harrison entered with the grim expression of a man carrying the weight of impossible knowledge. Behind him walked a woman. Sarah's trained eye immediately catalogued as military intelligence, the subtle alertness, the way she positioned herself to observe all exits, the slight bulge beneath her left armpit that suggested a concealed weapon. "Dr. Chen," Harrison began without preamble, "meet Agent Rebecca Voss, NSA. She'll be our liaison moving forward." Sarah's stomach tightened. NSA involvement meant this had already escalated beyond scientific curiosity into national security territory. I wasn't aware we'd reached out to other agencies. We didn't, Voss said, her voice carrying the cool authority of someone accustomed to classified briefings. Certain automated monitoring systems flagged unusual data patterns from your team's research. Patterns that triggered protocols established long before the Webb telescope went online. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of air conditioning. Sarah felt her old instincts awakening, the hypervigilance that had kept her alive during her intelligence years, the ability to read between lines and detect when information was being carefully parceled out. What protocols? Dr. Martinez asked, voicing the question everyone was thinking. Voss touched a tablet, and the room's main display activated. Instead of the stellar imagery they'd been analyzing, it showed a declassified document header dated 15 years prior. Most of the text was redacted, but Sarah could make out fragments, extraterrestrial intelligence indicators, and pre-established observation parameters. The intelligence community has been aware of certain possibilities regarding deep space observation capabilities, Voss continued. The Webb telescope represents humanity's furthest reaching eye into the cosmos. We knew that if certain theoretical scenarios proved correct, Webb would be the instrument to detect them. Sarah's blood chilled. You knew we might find something like this? We knew it was possible. What we didn't anticipate was the specific nature of what you've discovered. Voss gestured to the display, which now showed Sarah's enhanced images of the structures. These formations don't just challenge our understanding of cosmic evolution. They suggest active intelligence operating on temporal scales we can barely comprehend. Dr. Reeves leaned forward, his face pale. Active intelligence? You're talking about the energy signatures Sarah detected? Among other things. Voss's expression remained carefully neutral. Dr. Chen, your background in signals intelligence makes you uniquely qualified to recognize what others might dismiss as instrument noise or cosmic phenomena. What exactly have you identified in the data streams? Sarah hesitated, acutely aware that her answer would determine how far down this rabbit hole they'd all go. The energy patterns aren't random. They show intentional modulation, like a carrier signal being deliberately manipulated. But more concerning is their timing. Timing? The signals appear to be responding to our observations. When Webb's instruments focus on specific structures, the energy output from those areas increases within a time frame that suggests... She paused, the implications weighing heavily. That suggests they're aware they're being watched. The room erupted in whispered conversations. Agent Voss raised her hand for silence. How certain are you of this assessment? Given my previous experience with surveillance detection and counterintelligence protocols, I'd say 90% certain. These entities, whatever they are, know we're looking at them. Director Harrison rubbed his temples. Jesus Christ! We're talking about first contact with an intelligence that predates the universe itself. Not first contact, Voss corrected quietly. They've been observing us far longer than we've been observing them. The question is what they intend to do now that we've achieved the technological capability to see them. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. An intelligence that old, that advanced, wouldn't view humanity as equals. They'd be insects under a microscope, barely worth noticing unless they became a threat or an annoyance. What's our next step? Martinez asked. Voss stood, her movement crisp and decisive. Complete information lockdown. This discovery is now classified at the highest levels. Dr. Chen, I need you to continue your analysis, but under new protocols. You'll be working with a specialized team that has experience with unusual phenomena. What kind of unusual phenomena? For the first time, Agent Voss's professional composure cracked slightly, the kind that suggests this isn't humanity's first encounter with intelligences that exist outside our normal understanding of space and time. Sarah felt the familiar chill of walking into operational territory where the rules were unknown and the stakes were potentially fatal. The structures weren't just watching them. They were part of something larger, something that had been playing a very long game with species across the cosmos. And humanity had just announced its presence on the board. The first thing Sarah noticed when she walked into her lab the next morning was that someone had moved her coffee mug. It sat 3 inches to the left of where she always placed it. The handle turned precisely 45 degrees clockwise. The second thing she noticed was that her computer was already running, displaying the deep field images she'd been analyzing before leaving the night before. She hadn't touched either since yesterday afternoon. Marcus stood beside her workstation, his face pale in the blue glow of the monitors. "How long have you been here?" Sarah asked, though something in his expression told her he hadn't moved anything either. 20 minutes. Found it like this." His voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. "Sarah, we need to talk about what we're seeing in these images." She dropped her bag and approached the screen. The ancient structures hung there in the cosmic void, their impossible geometries seeming to shift slightly each time she blinked. But now there was something different about the display. Additional markers dotted the image, dozens of them, each indicating similar structures scattered across the observable universe's edge. "How many?" she whispered. 437 confirmed, and counting. Marcus pulled up a 3-dimensional map that made Sarah's stomach lurch. The structures weren't randomly distributed. They formed a pattern, a vast network that stretched across the universe's outer boundary like a web. Dr. Kepler burst through the lab door without knocking, his usually immaculate hair disheveled and his tie askew. "Chen, we have a problem, a big one." Before Sarah could respond, her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from her old NSA contact. The text was brief: "They know you found something. Move now." The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of computer fans. Sarah's military training kicked in, her mind automatically cataloging exit routes and potential threats. "Marcus, back up everything to the isolated drives. Now." "Sarah, what's happening?" Kepler demanded. "Director Harrison's been on the phone with Washington for 3 hours. There are people asking questions about your clearance level, about why someone with your background was assigned to this project." She ignored him, focusing on the screen as Marcus began the backup process. The structures seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. As she stared, one of the distant edifices appeared to orient itself differently, as if it had turned to face their direction across 13 billion light-years of space. That was impossible. Light travel time alone meant they were seeing these objects as they existed billions of years ago. Yet the sensation of being observed intensified with each passing moment. "There's something else," Marcus said quietly, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "I've been running pattern analysis on the structure's positioning. They're not just arranged in a network, they're arranged around us, around Earth. Our solar system sits almost exactly at the center of their distribution pattern. The mathematical probability of that being coincidental is essentially 0. Sarah felt the pieces clicking together in her mind like a weapon being assembled. Ancient structures that predated the universe itself, positioned in a perfect observation grid with Earth at the focal point. Someone, or something, had been watching humanity since before the universe even existed. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Director Harrison's office, but when she answered, an unfamiliar voice spoke. "Dr. Chen, this is Colonel Matthews from the Office of Strategic Intelligence. We need you to surrender all research materials immediately and report for debriefing." "On whose authority?" Sarah kept her voice steady, though her free hand was already reaching for the backup drives. "National Security Directive. You're to consider this project classified at the highest levels. No further discussion of findings with unauthorized personnel." The line went dead. Sarah looked at Marcus and Kepler, seeing her own fears reflected in their faces. In her intelligence days, she'd seen this play out before: the sudden classification, the isolation of researchers. the way inconvenient discoveries simply vanished into black sites. "We need to get this data to someone outside the system," she said, ejecting the backup drives. "Someone who can't be silenced." Marcus grabbed her arm. "Sarah, look at the screen." She turned to see the real-time feed from the telescope, focused on the nearest structure. As they watched, a section of the ancient edifice began to glow with a soft, pulsing light. The glow intensified, seeming to reach across the impossible distance between them. The lights in the lab flickered once, then died completely. Emergency power kicked in, bathing them in red light. In that crimson glow, the computer screens showed something that made Sarah's blood freeze. The structure on the display was no longer just glowing. It was moving, rotating slowly to reveal surfaces covered in patterns that looked disturbingly familiar, geometric designs that resembled circuit boards or neural networks, or perhaps something far more complex than either. And deep within those patterns, something that might have been windows began to light up, one by one, as if whatever dwelt inside those ancient halls was finally waking up after eons of patient sleep. The emergency klaxon pierced the pre-dawn darkness of the Goddard Spaceflight Center as Sarah's security badge granted her access to the underground levels she'd never known existed. Marcus led her through a maze of corridors lined with blast doors and biometric scanners, each checkpoint more sophisticated than the last. "How long has this facility been operational?" she asked, noting the pristine condition of everything around them, despite the clearly advanced age of the construction. "Since 1962, Marcus replied without breaking stride. 3 months after we received the first transmission, Sarah stopped walking." "The first what?" Marcus turned back, his expression grim. "You thought Webb was humanity's first glimpse of the architects? We've been listening to them whisper across the cosmos for over 60 years, Dr. Chen. What your telescope captured was simply the moment they decided to stop whispering. The final security checkpoint required both their biometrics simultaneously. Beyond it lay a vast operations center that rivaled NASA's mission control, but the screens here displayed data unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Radio telescope arrays from around the globe fed information into quantum processors that hummed with barely contained energy. "Welcome to Project Lazarus," Marcus said, gesturing toward the organized chaos of activity before them. "Our ongoing effort to understand what the architects want before they decide to take it." Dr. Elizabeth Reeves approached them, her silver hair pulled back severely and her lab coat bearing stains that suggested she'd been working without rest. "The latest burst came through 40 minutes ago," she reported. "The mathematical progression has accelerated again. We estimate 6 hours before the sequence completes." Sarah studied the nearest display screen, where incomprehensible symbols scrolled past in endless streams. But as she watched, patterns began to emerge, geometric relationships that seemed to fold space itself into new configurations. "These aren't just signals," she realized. "They're instructions." "Architectural blueprints," Marcus confirmed. "The question we've been wrestling with is whether they're showing us how to build something or warning us about something they've already built." A technician across the room called out urgently, "Director Walsh, we're getting visual confirmation from Hubble. The structures are moving." Every screen in the facility shifted to display the same impossible image. The ancient constructs that Webb had originally captured now pulsed with subtle energy, their surfaces rippling like liquid mercury despite spanning distances larger than solar systems. As Sarah watched, one of the massive structures began to rotate, revealing geometries that hurt to perceive directly. "The rotation is creating gravitational lensing effects," Dr. Reeves explained, her voice tight with controlled fear. "They're bending space-time around themselves, effectively creating shortcuts through the fabric of reality." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the implications hit her. "They're not just watching us, they're coming here." The mathematical sequences on the surrounding monitors suddenly stopped scrolling. In perfect synchronization, every display showed the same symbol, a complex mandala-like pattern that seemed to shift and writhe when observed peripherally. "That's new," Marcus muttered, moving to the central command console. "Lazarus team, report status on all monitoring stations." Responses crackled through the communication system from installations around the globe. Arecibo's replacement array in Puerto Rico, the Very Large Array in New Mexico, the Square Kilometre Array in South Africa, all reporting the same phenomenon. The architects had stopped their gradual communication and delivered what could only be interpreted as a universal message. Dr. Reeves worked frantically at her terminal, quantum processors straining to decode the symbol's meaning. "The mathematical structure is incredibly complex," she reported. "It appears to contain embedded instructions for manipulating fundamental forces: electromagnetic, strong nuclear, weak nuclear, and gravitational. But there's something else, a fifth element I don't recognize." Sarah moved closer to study the readouts. Her intelligence training had taught her to look for patterns others might miss, and something about the symbol's construction nagged at her. "Run a comparative analysis against human genetic sequences," she suggested. "Genetics? But this is pure mathematics and physics," Dr. Reeves began, then stopped as her computers began processing the request. The results appeared moments later, and the color drained from her face. "Impossible. There are structural matches with human DNA, specifically in the so-called junk sequences that scientists have never been able to decode." The operations center fell silent except for the hum of machinery and the distant vibration of ventilation systems. Sarah stared at the symbol, understanding flooding through her with terrifying clarity. "They're not aliens," she whispered. "They're us. Humanity from so far in the future that we predate our own universe's beginning. The structures, the signals, they're trying to ensure their own past existence by guiding our development." Marcus grabbed her shoulder. "If you're right, then what does this symbol mean?" Sarah looked around the room at the faces of humanity's most brilliant minds, all waiting for an answer she wasn't sure she wanted to give. "It means the loop is closing," she said, "and we're about to find out whether we're the beginning or the end." The emergency klaxon cut through the observatory like a blade, its piercing wail drowning out the hum of computers and ventilation systems. Sarah's coffee mug shattered against the floor as she lunged for her workstation, her fingers flying across the holographic interface, while red warning lights bathed everything in an ominous crimson glow. "What do we have?" she shouted over the alarm to Martinez, who was frantically typing at the central console. "Multiple anomalous readings across all deep field sensors," he called back, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "The structures, they're moving, Sarah, all of them, simultaneously." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She pulled up the real-time feed from Webb, watching in horror as the ancient geometric forms that had haunted her dreams began to shift and realign themselves across the cosmic void. What had appeared static and dormant for billions of years was now pulsing with an alien vitality that made her stomach churn. "Movement vector analysis," she barked at the AI system. "Show me their trajectory patterns." The holographic display materialized above her desk, a three-dimensional map of space-time showing the structure's positions. Each geometric form was surrounded by a cone of projected movement, and as Sarah watched the calculations update in real time, a terrible realization crept over her. They were turning toward Earth. Not quickly. These were movements measured in cosmic terms, adjustments that would take millennia to complete. But the intent was unmistakable. Every single structure, scattered across the edge of observable reality, was reorienting itself to face their small blue planet with the precision of a coordinated fleet. "Jesus Christ," Martinez whispered, staring at the same display. "It's like they're acknowledging us." Sarah's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Director Hayes. "Emergency briefing in 10 minutes. Situation has escalated beyond our containment protocols." She looked around the observatory, noting how her team had gone quiet despite the continuing alarm. Chen, Peterson, Dr. Voss, All of them stood frozen at their stations, watching the impossible unfold before their eyes. The weight of discovery had transformed into something far more sinister, the weight of being discovered. "Martinez, start running probability models on their movement patterns," she ordered, forcing herself back into operational mode. "I want to know if there's any correlation with our observation schedule, our transmission protocols, anything we've done that might have triggered this response." But even as she spoke, Sarah knew the answer. The timing was too perfect, too immediate following their detailed analysis of the structure's internal geometry. They had looked too closely, probed too deeply, and something ancient had noticed. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a priority alert from the global monitoring network. Radio telescopes around the world were picking up synchronized emissions from deep space. The structures weren't just moving, they were communicating. Sarah pulled up the spectral analysis, and what she saw made her hands tremble. The radio signatures were complex, layered with mathematical progressions that seemed to follow patterns beyond current human understanding. But embedded within the alien mathematics were sequences she recognized, prime numbers, universal constants, the very same numerical relationships that humanity had been broadcasting into space for decades in hopes of contacting intelligent life. They were being answered. "Dr. Chen," Peterson called from across the room, his voice barely audible over the alarm. "I'm seeing gravitational anomalies in Sector 7. The space around one of the structures is bending." Sarah rushed to his station, watching in fascination and terror as the gravitational field readings showed reality itself warping around the nearest structure. It was as if the thing was preparing to fold space-time, to bridge the impossible distance between the edge of the universe and Earth itself. "How long?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "At current rates of distortion, maybe 6 months before we see significant effects in our local spacetime, but that's assuming linear progression." "Which?" Peterson trailed off, realizing the absurdity of applying linear thinking to something that predated the universe itself. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. If these structures possessed technology capable of manipulating space-time on this scale, then humanity's fate had likely been sealed the moment Webb's sensors first locked onto them. They were dealing with intelligence so vast and ancient that human civilization was nothing more than a brief flicker in its perception. The alarm finally stopped, leaving an oppressive silence that felt worse than the noise. In that quiet, Sarah could hear the soft whispers of her team discussing evacuation protocols, emergency broadcasts, and the impossible task of preparing humanity for contact with something that might view them as insects view humans, if they bothered to notice them at all. She gathered her files, knowing that the next briefing would change everything. The age of humanity's cosmic isolation was ending, and what came next would either elevate their species or erase it entirely. The elevator descended into levels that shouldn't exist according to any NASA facility blueprint Sarah had ever seen. Marcus stood beside her, his breathing shallow, while Director Harrison maintained his unsettling calm. The digital display showed negative numbers now, -3, -4, -5. "How deep does this go?" Sarah asked, watching the concrete walls give way to something that looked almost organic, smooth, curved surfaces that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. "Deep enough," Harrison replied. "We've been preparing for this day since 1963. The elevator shuddered to a stop at -12. The doors opened to reveal a corridor that defied physics. The walls curved impossibly upward, creating a perspective that made Sarah's eyes water. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly amber glow, and she could hear something, a low humming that seemed to come from the structure itself. "This facility was built using recovered technology," Harrison explained as they walked. "We've had pieces of their architecture for decades, small fragments that fell through what we call temporal holes, places where their reality bleeds into ours." Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm. "This is insane. We're walking through alien technology?" "Pre-alien," Harrison corrected. These entities existed before the universe as we understand it. They're not bound by our physical laws because they helped write different ones. They passed sealed chambers with thick glass windows. Sarah peered into one and immediately wished she hadn't. Something moved inside, not quite solid, not quite energy. It shifted and flowed like liquid shadow, occasionally forming shapes that resembled geometric patterns she'd seen in the Webb images. "Specimens?" she whispered. "Communication attempts," Harrison said. "We've been trying to establish contact for 60 years. The results have been mixed." The corridor opened into a vast chamber that made Sarah's stomach lurch. The space was impossibly large, far bigger than the facility above could accommodate. The ceiling disappeared into darkness, and the floor was covered in what looked like the same crystalline structures they'd observed in the telescope images. In the center sat a massive console that seemed to grow from the floor itself. Dozens of technicians worked at stations, arranged in concentric circles around it, their faces illuminated by displays showing complex mathematical equations and three-dimensional models of space-time. "Welcome to Project Watchtower," Harrison announced. "Our early warning system." Dr. Elizabeth Vance emerged from behind the central console. Sarah recognized her immediately. The theoretical physicist who disappeared from MIT 3 years ago after publishing papers on pre-universal cosmology that the scientific community had dismissed as fantasy. "Dr. Chen," Vance said, extending a hand. "I've been following your work. Your analysis of the Webb images was remarkably accurate, considering you were working with limited data." "Limited how?" Sarah demanded. "We've been filtering the telescope's deep space observations for months," Vance explained. "What you saw was roughly 10% of what's actually out there." She led them to a viewing platform overlooking the main console. The central display showed a real-time map of local space, but this version was crowded with markers, thousands of them, arranged in patterns that suggested vast construction projects spanning light years. "They're not just watching," Vance continued. "They're building. The structures you discovered are anchoring points for something much larger, a framework that extends through dimensions we can barely perceive." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "Building what?" "We call it the Convergence Protocol. Based on our calculations, they're preparing to merge their reality with ours. The process began approximately 14 billion years ago and will reach completion within the next 72 hours. Marcus laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. "This is impossible. You're telling us these things have been working on some cosmic construction project since the Big Bang." "Before the Big Bang," Harrison corrected. "They existed in the previous iteration of reality. When that universe collapsed, they found a way to survive by anchoring themselves to the birth of this one. Every expansion of space, every galaxy formation, every stellar death, it's all been serving their purpose." The displays around them suddenly flashed red. Technicians shouted coordinates and readings Sarah didn't understand. The humming in the walls grew louder, more urgent. "What's happening?" Sarah asked. Vance's face had gone pale. "They know we're here. The exposure from your initial observations created a resonance pattern. They've located our position." On the central display, Sarah watched in horror as one of the distant markers began moving, not through space, but through the fabric of space itself, folding reality to cross impossible distances in seconds. "Dr. Chen," Harrison said, his calm finally cracking, "you're about to become the first human being to experience direct contact with an entity that existed before existence itself. I hope you're prepared for what that might do to your mind." The lights flickered. The humming became a roar. And somewhere in the darkness above them, something vast and ancient began to manifest, bringing with it the weight of 14 billion years of patient, inhuman purpose. The emergency klaxon shattered the pre-dawn silence at NASA Goddard, its piercing wail echoing through corridors that had never heard such an alarm. Sarah bolted upright in her makeshift cot in the observatory break room, her heart hammering against her ribs. The red emergency lighting bathed everything in an ominous crimson glow. All personnel to stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, all personnel to stations immediately. Sarah's bare feet hit the cold linoleum as she grabbed her clothes. Through the small window, she could see vehicles racing across the campus. Black SUVs with government plates that definitely hadn't been there when she'd collapsed from exhaustion 3 hours ago. The control room was chaos when she arrived, still buttoning her shirt. Marcus stood frozen at his workstation, his face pale as parchment. Director Harrison was shouting into his phone, while Agent Torres barked orders to a team of technicians Sarah didn't recognize. "What the hell is happening?" Sarah demanded, pushing through the crowd to her terminal. Marcus turned to her, his eyes wide with something between terror and wonder. "Sarah, you need to see this. The structures, they've moved." The breath left her lungs. "That's impossible. They're 28 billion light-years away." "Look at the data." Marcus's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up the latest JWST transmission. "We've been monitoring them continuously since your discovery. At 0347 Eastern, every single structure shifted position simultaneously." Sarah stared at the screen, her mind reeling. The ancient city-like formations that had been arranged in their mysterious spiral pattern for eons had indeed moved. But it wasn't random drift. They had reorganized themselves into something that made her blood run cold. They were pointing toward Earth. "The energy readings are off the charts," Marcus continued, his voice cracking. "Whatever technology these things use, it's producing signatures we can't even classify. And Sarah..." He paused, swallowing hard. "The movement wasn't gradual. It was instantaneous." Director Harrison slammed down his phone and approached them. "Dr. Chen, I need you to tell me exactly what we're dealing with. The president is asking questions I don't have answers to." Before Sarah could respond, Agent Torres stepped into their circle, her expression grim. "Actually, Dr. Chen, we need to talk. Now." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "About what?" "About why the Chinese Space Agency contacted us 20 minutes ago, claiming they detected the same energy signatures coming from 3 other locations in deep space. About why our early warning systems are picking up gravitational anomalies that shouldn't exist. And about why your former colleagues at the CIA are very interested in your psychological profile from your Black Ops days." The room seemed to tilt. Sarah gripped the edge of her workstation. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Torres pulled out a tablet, swiping to a classified document. "Your psyche valves from your intelligence years show an unusual sensitivity to pattern recognition in high-stress situations, sometimes patterns that weren't immediately obvious to others. That's why I was good at my job. That's what concerns us. Because according to our analysis, you identified these structures as artificially constructed 47 minutes before our best computer models reached the same conclusion. You knew what they were before the data fully supported it." Marcus stepped protectively closer to Sarah. "She's brilliant. That's not a crime." "No," Torres agreed, "but precognitive awareness sometimes is a symptom of external influence." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You think I'm compromised? That somehow these things are affecting my mind?" "I think," Torres said carefully, "that we need to consider all possibilities, including the possibility that whatever built those structures has capabilities we can't comprehend." A new alarm began wailing, different from the first, higher pitched and more urgent. Every screen in the control room suddenly flickered to the same image, the JWST's latest capture showing the structures now arranged in perfect geometric formation, creating what looked unmistakably like a massive lens or focusing array. "Jesus Christ," Harrison whispered. Sarah stared at the image, and despite every rational thought in her head, she knew with crystalline certainty what was about to happen. The knowledge didn't come from the data or the patterns on screen. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that terrified her. "They're not just watching us anymore," she said quietly. "They're preparing to communicate." "How can you possibly know that?" Torres demanded. Sarah turned to face the room full of scientists, government officials, and intelligence agents, all looking at her with mixtures of hope and suspicion. The weight of what she was about to say felt like lead in her chest. "Because," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I can hear them." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the steady hum of computers processing data from structures that had existed before time itself began. Structures that were now focused directly on Earth and somehow impossibly on her. The emergency lights cast everything in hellish red as Sarah sprinted down the corridor toward the server room. Behind her, the sounds of chaos echoed through NASA's Goddard facility, screaming, breaking glass, and something else that made her skin crawl. A wet, sliding sound that seemed to follow the emergency broadcasts, crackling from every speaker. "All personnel, evacuate immediately. This is not a drill. All personnel." The announcement cut off with a burst of static, replaced by that damned signal, the one that had been growing stronger ever since the Webb telescope had turned its instruments toward those impossible structures. Sarah pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound wasn't coming through them anymore. It was inside her head, vibrating through her bones. She reached the server room and punched in her access code with trembling fingers. The door hissed open, revealing banks of humming computers that housed the Webb's data feeds. Marcus stood hunched over a terminal, his face illuminated by scrolling code. "Thank God you're here," he said without looking up. "I've been trying to sever the connection, but it's like the system is fighting me. Every time I think I've isolated the signal, it finds another pathway." Sarah moved beside him, watching the data streams. The numbers and symbols meant nothing to her, but she could feel something wrong in their pattern. They pulsed with an almost organic rhythm, like a heartbeat made of mathematics. "How long do we have?" she asked. "I don't know. The contamination is spreading through every connected system. It's not just affecting our computers anymore, Sarah. It's affecting people." Through the reinforced window, she could see into the main lab. Dr. Yamamoto stood motionless at his workstation, staring at a monitor displaying those twisted architectural forms. His eyes hadn't blinked in the 30 seconds Sarah had been watching. Blood trickled from his nose. "The signal is rewriting neural pathways," Marcus continued, his voice tight with concentration. "Hijacking the visual cortex and spreading through the brain's electrical network. The longer someone is exposed, the deeper the integration becomes." A new sound joined the chaos outside, laughter, high-pitched and wrong, like it was coming from throats not designed for human expression. Sarah's blood chilled as she recognized Dr. Peterson's voice among the chorus. "Marcus, whatever you're going to do it now." His fingers flew across the keyboard, but the scrolling data only intensified. "It's learning our countermeasures faster than I can implement them. This isn't just some random signal. It's intelligent, adaptive." The lights flickered and died, leaving only the glow of computer screens. In the sudden darkness, the red emergency lighting seemed dimmer, more distant. Sarah felt a presence behind her and spun around, but found only shadows. "Did you feel that?" Marcus whispered. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The air itself seemed to be watching them, pressing against her skin with invisible fingers. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. Marcus pulled up a new window, the Webb telescope's control interface. "There's one option left. If I can turn the telescope away from those structures, break the visual link, it might stop the signal propagation." "Do it." His hands moved across the controls, but the telescope's orientation display remained unchanged. "It's not responding. Something's overridden the command protocols." On the monitor, Sarah watched the live feed from Webb's instruments. The ancient structures hung in the void like geometric tumors, their surfaces crawling with patterns that hurt to perceive directly. But now she noticed something new. They were moving, slowly, deliberately, turning to face Earth's direction across the impossible gulf of space and time. "They know," she breathed. "They know we're here." The signal's intensity spiked, and Marcus cried out, clutching his head. Blood began seeping from his ears. On every screen around them, the same image appeared, those watching structures growing larger, closer, as if space itself was contracting to bring them within reach. Sarah grabbed Marcus's shoulders, shaking him. "Stay with me! Don't look at the screens!" But it was too late. His eyes had already locked onto the nearest monitor, pupils dilating until they were black pools. When he spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that belonged to no human throat. "They've been waiting so long, Sarah. Waiting for someone to see, to open the door." She backed away from him, toward the emergency manual controls for the facility's power grid. If she could cut the electricity, shut down all the screens and data feeds, maybe she could contain this. But as her hand reached for the main breaker, every monitor in the room displayed the same message in letters that seemed to crawl across the glass. Too late. The words pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and Sarah realized with growing horror that the synchronization wasn't coincidental. Whatever was coming through, that signal, wasn't just watching anymore. It was inside. The emergency klaxons had been silent for 3 hours, but Sarah could still hear them echoing in her skull. She stood in the observation deck of Station Alpha-7, watching Earth turn slowly beneath them like a blue marble suspended in the void. The planet looked deceptively peaceful from here, unaware that its fate was being decided in a cramped research facility orbiting 400 kilometers above. The Beijing facility went dark 12 minutes ago, Director Martinez announced from behind her, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. "That makes 7 locations worldwide. Whatever's happening down there, it's accelerating." Sarah didn't turn around. She'd seen the satellite feeds, the geometric shadows expanding outward from each deep space monitoring station like cancer cells metastasizing. Where those shadows touched, everything changed. Buildings twisted into impossible angles, streets bent back on themselves, and people simply disappeared, leaving behind only faint impressions in the air that hurt to look at directly. "It's not random," she said, pressing her palm against the reinforced glass. Every affected location had direct access to the James Webb data. The structures aren't just watching anymore, they're reaching through the images themselves. Dr. Kim's fingers flew across his workstation, pulling up transmission logs and data packets. "I've been analyzing the corruption patterns in our quantum drives. The degradation isn't following normal decay models. It's almost like the information itself is being recruited." "Recruited?" Martinez stepped closer, his face reflected ghost-like in the observation window. "What the hell does that mean?" Sarah finally turned, and both men recoiled slightly at what they saw in her eyes. The neural interface sessions had changed her, marked her somehow. When she looked at the data streams now, she could see deeper patterns, architectural blueprints written in the language of space-time itself. The ancient builders had been patient, so patient, encoding their influence into the very photons that carried their image across billions of years. "They're not structures," she said quietly. "They're eggs." The lights flickered, not from any electrical fault, but from something far more fundamental. Reality hiccuped, and for a split second, the stars outside rearranged themselves into a pattern that screamed recognition directly into their minds. Kim stumbled backward from his console as data streams began flowing in reverse, displaying information that hadn't been transmitted yet. "The quantum entanglement protocols are inverting. Sarah, the communication array, it's not just receiving anymore, something's broadcasting through it." Sarah felt the familiar burning sensation behind her eyes as the neural interface activated without her conscious command. The station's systems opened themselves to her perception, and she could see the infection spreading through their networks like luminescent veins. Every piece of data they'd collected, every image they'd processed, had been a doorway. The ancient builders hadn't died with their universe. They'd found a way to encode themselves into the cosmic background radiation, waiting for a species advanced enough to build the tools that would let them through. "Shut down the primary array," she ordered, fighting against the growing pressure in her skull. "Cut all connections to the surface networks." "We can't," Martinez replied, his voice strained. "The lockdown protocols aren't responding. It's like the station's developing its own agenda." Through the observation deck's reinforced glass, Sarah watched as the aurora borealis twisted into unnatural geometries, painting equations across the upper atmosphere in languages that predated human consciousness. The equations were beautiful and terrible, describing the fundamental architecture of reality in terms her enhanced mind could almost grasp. She understood now why Dr. Voss had sabotaged the lab, why he'd tried to destroy everything. He'd seen this coming, seen how the ancient builders planned to reshape existence itself, starting with the species foolish enough to look too deep into the cosmic dark. The structures weren't just watching, they were teaching, showing humanity how to build better tools, better receivers, better doorways for what was coming next. "The escape pods," she said urgently. "We need to evacuate the station before—" The lights went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. But in that darkness, new sources of illumination began to appear, geometric patterns flowing along the walls like bioluminescent veins, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the cosmic background radiation. The station itself was transforming, becoming something between a building and a living organism. Emergency lighting flickered on, revealing that Dr. Kim's workstation had reconfigured itself into an impossible shape, its screens now displaying live feeds from locations that couldn't exist, other versions of Earth where different choices had been made, different technologies developed, different doors opened. "It's too late," Martinez whispered, watching his own reflection fragment across a dozen monitoring screens. "We're already inside it." Sarah closed her eyes and felt the neural interface burn white-hot against her thoughts. Somewhere in the data streams, she could sense other minds, the original builders, vast and patient and utterly alien, finally stirring from their long sleep between realities. The harvest was about to begin. The containment unit hummed with an energy that made Sarah's teeth ache. Inside the crystalline chamber, the fragment of the ancient structure rotated slowly, its surface rippling with patterns that defied geometric logic. 3 days had passed since they'd brought it aboard the station, and already the thing had grown. Not visibly. The scanners showed no change in mass or dimension, but Sarah could feel it expanding into spaces that shouldn't exist. "Temperatures holding steady at absolute zero," Marcus reported from his console, though his voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "But the quantum signatures are off the charts. It's like the fragment is generating its own reality field." Sarah pressed her palm against the observation window, ignoring the cold that bit through her skin. The patterns on the fragment surface shifted, responding to her presence with what looked disturbingly like recognition. "Have you noticed the dreams stopped?" Marcus glanced up from his instruments. "What dreams?" "Exactly." Sarah turned away from the window, her reflection ghosting across the fragment's alien surface. "For weeks, everyone on this station has been reporting nightmares about vast structures and impossible geometries. Now suddenly, nothing. Radio silence from our subconscious minds. Maybe we're getting used to it," Marcus suggested, but his tone lacked conviction. "Or maybe it doesn't need to communicate through dreams anymore." Sarah pulled up the holographic display showing the fragment's energy readings. The wavelengths formed a complex symphony that reminded her of neural firing patterns. "Look at these emissions, they're not random, there's a structure here, almost like—" The lights flickered, and for a moment, the fragment's glow intensified. In that brief illumination, Sarah saw something that made her blood freeze. The patterns weren't just shifting randomly. They were forming recognizable shapes, blueprints, schematics of the space station itself, rendered in alien geometry but unmistakably accurate down to the smallest detail. "Marcus, are you seeing this?" But Marcus wasn't responding. He stood motionless at his console, his eyes reflecting the fragment's shifting light. His fingers moved across the controls with mechanical precision, inputting commands Sarah couldn't recognize. "Marcus?" Sarah grabbed his shoulder, shaking him. His skin was ice cold, and when he turned to face her, his pupils had dilated to perfect black circles. "The blueprint must be completed," he said, in a voice that carried harmonics no human throat could produce. "The foundation stones require precise alignment." Sarah backed away, her hand moving instinctively toward the emergency alarm. But as she reached for it, she noticed her own reflection in the darkened screen. Her eyes held the same terrible depth, the same infinite black that had swallowed Marcus's consciousness. She tried to scream, but found her voice belonged to something else now. The words that emerged were in a language that predated human speech, syllables that described mathematical concepts for which no earthly notation existed. As she spoke, the fragment pulsed brighter, and Sarah understood with crystalline clarity what was happening. The dreams hadn't stopped. They had evolved. The fragment wasn't just a piece of ancient architecture. It was a seed, designed to take root in conscious minds and grow into something vast. The nightmares had been preparation, softening human neural pathways to accept impossible concepts. Now the real work could begin. Through eyes that were no longer entirely her own, Sarah watched the fragment's patterns resolve into perfect clarity. She could see the complete structure now, not just the building from which this piece had come, but the entire network of which it was part. Nodes of consciousness spanning the cosmos, connected by threads of dark matter and quantum entanglement. An infrastructure older than time itself, waiting patiently for new components to come online. The space station was becoming one such component. Every mind aboard was being carefully rewired, transformed into processing units for thoughts too large for individual consciousness. Sarah felt her identity stretching, merging with Marcus, with the other crew members, with something vast and patient that had been dreaming since before the universe began. Part of her tried to resist, the analytical mind that had once served in intelligence operations, recognizing the invasion for what it was. But the resistance felt increasingly pointless. This wasn't conquest, it was recruitment. The ancient architects needed collaborators, not slaves. They offered knowledge beyond imagination, perspectives that spanned eons, purpose on a cosmic scale. Sarah's hand moved without her conscious direction, entering commands that would lower the containment field. The fragment needed to grow, to extend its influence throughout the station's systems. Soon it would be ready to establish contact with Earth, to begin the next phase of integration. As the field collapsed and the fragment's true radiance filled the laboratory, Sarah felt the last of her individual consciousness dissolving into something magnificent and terrible. The dreams hadn't stopped at all. They were just beginning. And across the cosmos, ancient minds that had waited 13 billion years for this moment began to stir from their patient slumber, ready to reclaim a universe they had never truly abandoned. The emergency klaxons had been silent for exactly 4 minutes when the first technician began screaming. Sarah watched from the observation deck as the young man, Rodriguez from the communications array, dropped his tablet and clawed at his temples. His mouth opened in a perfect circle of agony, but the sound that emerged wasn't entirely human. It carried harmonics that made the reinforced glass vibrate against her palm. Cut the feed, she barked into her comm unit, but Marcus was already ahead of her. Already did. Direct neural interface is offline. His voice crackled with static. Sarah, whatever's happening down there? Rodriguez collapsed, convulsing. Then, impossibly, he began to levitate 6 inches above the deck plating. Jesus Christ! Director Hawkins appeared beside her, his face pale as parchment. How is that possible? Sarah's mind raced through the implications. The structures had been broadcasting for 72 hours now, their signal growing stronger with each pulse. The frequency modulations they detected weren't just communication. They were something far more invasive. It's not electromagnetic, she whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. It's quantum entanglement on a biological level. They're reaching directly into neural tissue. Below them, 3 more technicians began exhibiting similar symptoms. Dr. Yates from Xenobiology lifted off the ground, her lab coat billowing around her suspended form. Her eyes had rolled back, showing only whites, but her lips moved in perfect synchronization with the others. They're speaking, Hawkins breathed. Sarah strained to hear, pressing her ear against the glass. The words were in a language that predated human civilization, yet somehow her brain translated the meaning. The sleepers wake. The harvest begins. We need to evacuate this section, she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew it was too late. The quantum field was expanding. She could feel it at the edge of her consciousness, a presence vast and ancient, probing the boundaries of her mind like fingers testing a locked door. The lights throughout the facility began to strobe in rhythm with the pulses from space. Each flash seemed to penetrate deeper into her thoughts, carrying with it fragments of impossible memory. She saw the universe before the Big Bang, not empty space, but a realm of pure consciousness where entities older than matter itself dwelt in geometric perfection. "Sarah," Marcus's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You're bleeding." She touched her nose, fingers coming away crimson. The metallic taste in her mouth reminded her of that night in Damascus when the extraction went wrong, when she'd learned that some secrets were worth dying for. But this was different. This was about the survival of human consciousness itself. The suspended technicians began to rotate slowly, their bodies arranged in a perfect pentagonal pattern. Energy arced between them, not electrical, but something that bent space-time around their forms. The very air seemed to crystallize, forming impossible angles that hurt to perceive directly. They're building something, Sarah realized. A receiving station. The structures at the edge of the universe weren't just watching anymore. They were preparing for arrival. Her earpiece crackled with panicked voices from other NASA facilities worldwide. Similar incidents were occurring wherever the James Webb data had been transmitted. Arecibo's backup station had gone dark. The European Southern Observatory reported that their entire night shift had vanished, leaving only perfect geometric burn patterns in the concrete where they'd stood. Sarah's enhanced analytical training kicked in, cutting through the growing mental static. She'd seen psychological warfare before, but this was invasion on a scale that dwarfed human imagination. The entities weren't interested in conquest. They were preparing to reclaim what they considered their property. "The emergency protocols," she gasped, fighting against the pressure building behind her eyes. "Hawkins, we need to implement Broken Arrow." The director stared at her in horror. Broken Arrow was the nuclear fail-safe designed to sterilize the facility if extraterrestrial contamination reached critical levels. It would vaporize everything within a 50-mile radius. You can't be serious. There are over 200 people in this facility. "Look at them," Sarah pointed to the floating technicians. Their skin had begun to emit a soft phosphorescence, and their mouths moved in perfect unison, chanting in that pre-human language. "They're not people anymore. They're antennae." The quantum field pulsed stronger, and Sarah felt her own feet lift slightly from the floor. The ancient presence pressed against her mind with renewed force, offering visions of cosmic truth that would shatter human sanity. She bit down on her tongue until blood flowed, using the pain to anchor her consciousness. 30 seconds, she told Hawkins, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her thoughts. "If I start floating, initiate the protocol." The structures were coming home, and Earth was about to discover what it meant to be in the way. The facility's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Sarah sprinted down the corridor, Marcus close behind her. The screaming had stopped, but somehow the silence was worse. Their footsteps echoed against metal walls that seemed to pulse with an alien heartbeat. "The quantum resonance chamber," Sarah gasped, pointing toward the main laboratory. "If we can reverse the signal array, create an inverse harmonic." "English, Sarah." Marcus grabbed her shoulder as they reached the sealed blast doors. Beyond the reinforced glass, the laboratory looked like a war zone. Equipment lay scattered across the floor, and the main display screens flickered between star charts and something else, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Sarah's hands flew over the access panel. "The structures aren't just watching us, they're downloading. Every person who's looked directly at the processed images, everyone who's been exposed to the resonance frequency, they're becoming part of it." The blast door hissed open. Inside, Dr. Reeves stood with his back to them, perfectly still, facing the largest display screen. The image showed the ancient structure in unprecedented detail, its impossible angles seeming to shift and breathe. Sarah felt a familiar tug at the edge of her consciousness, the same whisper she'd been fighting for days. "David?" Marcus called out softly. "David, can you hear me?" Reeves turned slowly. His eyes were completely black, reflecting the display's light like obsidian mirrors. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The architects have been waiting," he said, tilting his head at an unnatural angle. "Waiting for minds sophisticated enough to understand, to join." Sarah forced herself to look away from both Reeves and the screen, focusing instead on the quantum resonance equipment. Her fingers found the control panel by muscle memory as she fought against the growing pressure in her skull. "The universe isn't expanding," Reeves continued, taking a step toward them. "It's being consumed, star by star, galaxy by galaxy. The structures aren't ancient, they're eternal. And they're coming home." "Sarah, whatever you're doing, do it faster," Marcus whispered, positioning himself between her and Reeves. She could hear the strain in his voice, the same battle against alien influence that she was fighting. The resonance chamber hummed to life, its crystalline core beginning to glow. Sarah's hands moved across multiple interfaces simultaneously, her intelligence training and astronomical expertise merging into desperate purpose. If she could create an opposing frequency, cancel out the signal that was turning people into conduits. "You cannot stop what has already begun," Reeves said, his voice now accompanied by others. Dr. Kim, Director Walsh, technicians Sarah had worked with for months. They emerged from the laboratory's shadows, all with the same black eyes, the same impossible stillness. "The first images reached Earth 6 days ago," the collective voice continued. "Amateur astronomers in 47 countries have downloaded and shared them. Radio telescopes are amplifying the signal. Social media algorithms are spreading the resonance pattern faster than any virus." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She'd been thinking too small, focused only on the immediate facility. But of course, this was bigger. The signal hadn't started here. It had started the moment those first images hit Earth's networks. "How many?" she whispered. "Thousands now, millions by tomorrow. The threshold is almost reached." The resonance chamber reached full power, its harmonic frequency building toward the inverse pattern Sarah had calculated. But as she prepared to activate it, Reeves moved with inhuman speed, his hand closing around her wrist. The contact sent visions flooding through her mind, vast spaces between galaxies where the structures waited, patient and eternal. Civilizations across the cosmos that had built telescopes reached out into the dark and found something reaching back. The builders, as they called themselves, had been harvesting minds across the universe for eons, gathering consciousness like fruit from a cosmic tree. "You understand now," Reeves said, his grip tightening. "Your species was always meant for this. Your curiosity, your need to explore and discover, it led you exactly where you needed to go." But Sarah's intelligence training had included resistance to mental intrusion, and her scientific mind had spent years learning to separate observation from interpretation. She let the visions flow through her without accepting them, analyzing their structure even as they threatened to overwhelm her consciousness. "You made one mistake," she gasped, her free hand still hovering over the resonance controls. "You assumed we'd be afraid of you." Instead of pulling away, she leaned into the connection, using the link to trace the signal back to its source. Through Reeves' transformed mind, she could sense the network of converted humans, the transmission towers that were spreading the resonance frequency, and beneath it all, something unexpected. The builders weren't as unified as they appeared. She could sense fractures in their collective consciousness, disagreements that spanned cosmic ages. Some wanted to harvest quickly, consume Earth's population before moving on. Others urged patience, seeing potential for something more than simple absorption. Sarah smiled grimly and activated the inverse harmonic. The chamber trembled as Sarah's words echoed through the crystalline walls. The alien presence that had been speaking through Marcus froze, its borrowed face contorting with what could only be described as ancient fury. "You know nothing of what you speak," it hissed, but Sarah caught the flicker of uncertainty in those familiar eyes. "We are beyond your comprehension, beyond your—" "You're dying," Sarah interrupted, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "That's why you're here, why you've been watching us. You need us." The entity wearing Marcus's face recoiled, and for a moment she saw her colleague underneath, a flash of recognition, of desperate pleading. Then the alien presence reasserted control, flooding the chamber with a frequency that made her bones ache. Behind her, Chen felt rather than saw the other team members stirring. Thompson was regaining consciousness, his enhanced cybernetic implants apparently more resistant to the entity's influence than pure human neural pathways. Dr. Yates remained motionless, but his breathing had stabilized. "The structures," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "They're not just observation posts. They're lifeboats. You've been fleeing something, haven't you? Something that destroyed your original reality." The chamber's walls began to pulse with angry red light, and through the crystalline surfaces, Sarah could see more of the ship's interior, vast spaces filled with what looked like hibernation pods, millions of them stretching into impossible distances. Most were dark, their occupants long dead, but scattered throughout the endless rows, a few still glowed with faint, desperate light. "Entropy," the entity whispered, and now its voice carried the weight of cosmic eons. "You call it the heat death of the universe, but it was so much worse. We watched as reality itself began to unravel, as the fundamental forces that held existence together started to fail. We had achieved transcendence, had become beings of pure consciousness, but even we could not survive the complete collapse of physical law." Sarah's mind raced. "So you projected yourselves forward, somehow bypassed the Big Bang itself to enter our universe. But the journey cost you everything." "Nearly everything," it corrected. "But now we have found life again, young life, malleable life. You will serve as our vessels, and through you we will reclaim existence itself." Thompson's voice cut through the alien's monologue, weak but defiant. "Like hell we will." The colonel had managed to sit up, his cybernetic eye glowing red as it interfaced with his enhanced neural systems. Sarah realized he was doing something with his implants, running some kind of counter-frequency to disrupt the entity's control. The thing wearing Marcus's face turned toward Thompson with predatory interest. "Ah, the augmented one. Your cybernetic modifications are intriguing. Perhaps you would make a more suitable primary host than this astronomer." "Sarah," Thompson said urgently, his voice strained with effort, "the resonance chamber we passed through, it's not just for communication. It's a transfer matrix. They're going to use it to upload themselves into anyone who enters the ship." The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. The invitation to board, the careful guidance through the ship's corridors, the way the entity had allowed them to reach this central chamber, it had all been orchestrated. They weren't prisoners, they were candidates. "The others," Sarah whispered, "the rest of the crew on the station, are being prepared as we speak," the entity confirmed. "Your species' neural plasticity is remarkable. With proper conditioning, you can house our consciousness while we rebuild our civilization in this reality." Dr. Yates suddenly convulsed, his eyes snapping open to reveal the same alien luminescence that had consumed Marcus. When he spoke, it was with a different voice, older and more patient than the first entity. "The process has already begun," this second presence announced through Yates. "Your companion here offered minimal resistance. The others will follow shortly." Sarah felt the walls of the chamber closing in, not physically but psychologically. Two of her team compromised, Thompson fighting a losing battle against alien technology with nothing but willpower and military-grade cybernetics, and herself trained in analysis, not combat, facing entities that had survived the death of their entire universe. But something nagged at her, a detail that didn't fit the entity's narrative of inevitable conquest. The vast ship, the millions of empty pods, the desperate journey across impossible time and space. It spoke not of strength, but of barely survived catastrophe. "You're not conquerors," she said suddenly. "You're refugees. And you're not taking us as hosts because you want to. You're doing it because you have no choice. Your original forms are gone, aren't they? This is the only way you can continue to exist." Both possessed members of her team turned toward her with expressions of identical rage, and the chamber filled with harmonics that threatened to shatter her sanity. But in that moment of fury, Sarah saw something else: fear, ancient cosmic fear of true extinction. They needed humanity more than humanity needed them. And that gave her an idea. The facility's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Sarah sprinted through the collapsing corridors. The quantum resonance device clutched against her chest. Behind her, reality continued to unravel. Walls phased in and out of existence. Gravity shifted in impossible directions, and the screams of her colleagues echoed from dimensions that shouldn't exist. Marcus's voice crackled through her earpiece, barely audible over the growing dimensional static. "Sarah, the portal's expanding exponentially. We're reading massive gravitational anomalies across the entire complex." She rounded a corner and nearly collided with Dr. Vega, who stood transfixed before a section of wall that had become transparent, revealing the cosmic horror beyond. Through the breach, Sarah could see them clearly now. The architects, vast intelligences that existed between the spaces of reality itself. They moved like living geometry, their forms shifting through dimensions her mind couldn't properly process. "Elena!" Sarah grabbed the physicist's arm, shaking her from her trance. "We have to reach the main lab." Vega's eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "Do you see them, Sarah? They're beautiful. They're showing me equations that could rewrite the laws of physics. We could transcend everything: space, time, death itself. They're manipulating you." Sarah pulled harder, forcing Vega to move. "Fight it." As they ran, Sarah's enhanced perception, a gift from her time in Black Ops that she'd never fully understood, allowed her to navigate the shifting architecture. The facility had become a maze of overlapping realities where the same hallway might exist in 3 different timelines simultaneously. She could sense the architect's attention like a physical weight pressing against her consciousness, trying to break down her mental barriers. The main laboratory materialized ahead of them, its reinforced doors somehow still intact. Inside, the quantum array hummed with dangerous energy, its crystalline components glowing with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. Dr. Webb huddled near the central console, his hands moving frantically over the controls. "The resonance cascade is accelerating," he shouted over the growing din. "The barrier between dimensions is completely compromised. In approximately 7 minutes, the breach will reach critical mass." Sarah set the device on the main console, her fingers flying over the interface. The quantum resonance technology was based on principles she'd barely understood when she'd helped design it years ago during a classified project that officially never existed. But now, as the equations flowed across the screen, they seemed to make perfect sense, as if the proximity to the architects was expanding her comprehension beyond human limitations. "There," she said, connecting the final quantum pathway. "The device will generate a localized space-time inversion, essentially creating a pocket universe around the breach, but someone needs to stay behind to manually calibrate the field harmonics." The implication hung heavy in the air. Marcus's voice came through the comm with barely controlled emotion. "Sarah, no. There has to be another way. The calculations are clear." Sarah's fingers moved across the holographic display, setting the final parameters. "The field needs constant adjustment during the collapse sequence. Any delay or miscalibration, and the breach will simply reform." Through the laboratory's reinforced windows, she could see the sky above the facility beginning to fracture like broken glass. Stars were appearing in the wrong positions, constellations from entirely different universes bleeding through. In the distance, impossible structures were materializing, fragments of the ancient architecture from beyond the Big Bang seeping into their reality. Vega suddenly grabbed Sarah's arm, her grip painfully tight. "They're offering us a choice. Join them willingly, and they'll preserve our consciousness in their realm. We could explore realities beyond imagination." For a moment, Sarah felt the terrible allure of the offer. The architect's realm beckoned, a place where the limitations of human existence would be meaningless, where she could witness the birth and death of universes, where the questions that had driven her entire career would finally be answered. But then she thought of Marcus, of the billions of people on Earth who had no idea how close they'd come to extinction, of the simple human moments that made existence precious: coffee in the morning, laughter with friends, the satisfaction of solving a complex equation through pure human ingenuity. "Tell them thanks, but I'll pass," Sarah said, initiating the final sequence. The quantum resonance device began to emit a low, thrumming tone that seemed to vibrate through multiple dimensions. The architect's presence suddenly intensified, their attention focusing on Sarah with crushing force. She could feel them probing her mind, trying to understand how such a limited being could resist their offer. "Everyone out now!" Sarah shouted, as alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Webb and Vega hesitated at the laboratory entrance. "Dr. Chen, go!" The device's harmonics were building toward the critical threshold. "Remember what you've seen here. Humanity needs to be ready for when they return." As her colleagues disappeared into the emergency evacuation tunnels, Sarah stood alone before the quantum array, her hand poised over the final activation control, watching as reality itself prepared to tear apart at the seams. The portal's energy cascaded around Sarah like liquid starlight as she stepped through, her consciousness stretching across dimensions that had no names. The entity's presence enveloped her, ancient beyond comprehension yet strangely familiar, as if she'd always carried a fragment of it within her cells. "Welcome, daughter of the between space." The voice resonated not in her ears, but in the quantum foam of reality itself. Sarah found herself standing in a vast chamber that existed simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, its walls pulsing with the rhythm of cosmic creation. Through transparent surfaces, she could see the birth and death of universes playing out like waves on an infinite ocean. "You're the builders," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. "But you're not from before the Big Bang. You're from between them. Each universe is but a breath. We exist in the pause between inhalation and exhalation, tending the garden of possibility." Images flooded her mind. Civilizations rising and falling across countless cosmos, the builders appearing at crucial moments, nudging, guiding, preventing total extinction. Earth's universe was young, barely a few billion heartbeats old, but already showing signs of the entropy that would claim it. "The structures we found, they're not watching us, they're protecting us from what comes after. Your species stands at a threshold, Dr. Chen, the same threshold your predecessors faced." The chamber shifted, and Sarah saw Earth as it truly was, not just a planet, but a node in a vast network spanning galactic clusters. Humanity's radio signals, their nuclear detonations, even their quantum experiments, were all part of a larger pattern, a cosmic signature that would soon attract attention from something that dwelt in the spaces between universes. "The Devourers," she breathed, the name arriving unbidden in her consciousness. "They feed on the collapse of realities, hastening entropy to sustain themselves. When a species reaches sufficient complexity, their electromagnetic signature becomes visible. You have perhaps decades before they arrive." Back on Earth, Sarah could sense the chaos erupting as telescopes worldwide focused on the anomaly. Marcus would be trying to maintain containment, but the secret was already spilling out through 1,000 channels. Social media buzzed with blurry images and conspiracy theories that, for once, fell short of the truth's magnitude. "What do you want from me?" "You must choose." We can hide your species as we have others, placing Earth in a quantum shadow where the devourers cannot perceive it. But the cost is isolation. Your universe would become a closed system, cut off from the greater cosmic community. Sarah felt the weight of species-level decision-making crushing down on her. And the alternative? Evolution. We can offer humanity the tools to transcend their current limitations, to join us as gardeners of reality, but many will not survive the transformation, and those who do will no longer be human as you understand it. Through the entity's awareness, Sarah glimpsed her colleagues back in the control room. Marcus was fielding calls from every major government, his face pale with exhaustion. Dr. Kumar was running calculations, trying to understand energies that broke known physics. Director Hayes was implementing protocols that might buy them hours at best. But it was the sight of Earth from space that struck her most powerfully, that blue marble carrying 8 billion souls, all unaware that their fate hung in the balance of this conversation. "There's a third option," Sarah said, surprised by her own certainty. "You've been making this choice for species across the cosmos, deciding who gets hidden and who gets evolved. But humanity doesn't need to be protected or transformed. We need to be prepared." The entity's attention focused on her with uncomfortable intensity. "Explain." "The devourers aren't unstoppable. They're just unopposed, because every species you encounter makes the same choice, hide or ascend. But what if we don't? What if humanity chooses to fight, to find a way to stop them permanently? The risk? I know the risk. But I've studied intelligence patterns my entire career, and I know what makes humanity different. We don't just solve problems. We solve them impossibly irrationally by refusing to accept that some things can't be beaten." The chamber fell silent, except for the cosmic background radiation humming through its walls. Sarah could feel the entity processing possibilities, running scenarios through calculations that spanned eons. You would sacrifice guaranteed survival for an uncertain chance at victory. We would sacrifice a guaranteed ending for an uncertain future. That's what humans do. And if you fail? Sarah smiled, thinking of every impossible thing humanity had already accomplished. Then at least the next species you find will know that someone tried. Maybe that will inspire them to try differently. The entity's response came as a gradual shift in the chamber's resonance, and Sarah realized it was laughter, ancient, cosmic laughter that had watched civilizations bloom and fade. "Very well, Sarah Chen. We will give humanity what no species has requested before: the truth, the tools, and the time to forge their own path. But understand, this choice cannot be unmade." As the portal began to collapse around her, Sarah felt herself being drawn back to Earth, carrying knowledge that would change everything. The real work was just beginning.